So, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about an Omega level commander. And an Omega level commander is a commander that is incredibly powerful and a massive threat. And the Omega level commander that we're going to be talking about on this episode is Go-Shintai of Life's Origin. Go-Shintai of Life's Origin is a 3/4 legendary enchantment creature shrine that costs 3 and a green. It has pay, Wooburg, tap, return target enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And whenever Go-Shintai of Life's Origin or another non-token shrine enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 colorless shrine enchantment creature token. Now, shrines are a type of enchantment that get more and more powerful with the more and more shrines that are in play. And this shrine commander can make a ton of shrines. Because again, whenever this or any of your shrines come into play, you get a shrine creature token, and of course there are plenty of ways to use and abuse that to make even more shrines. Of course, that's on top of the fact that this has an activated ability that can get you any of your shrines from your graveyard back into play, which again gets you another shrine, or, again, obviously, it can get you basically any of your enchantments from your graveyard right onto the battlefield. Now, this Omega level commander can be built in a couple of different ways. First off, you can focus on that ability to get enchantments from your graveyard back into play. So a certain build might be built around, a very powerful enchantment like something like Omniscience. Now, that is not this build. Omniscience is definitely not a budget card. This is going to be a Shrine Tribal build, and yeah, there are some really powerful things that we can do with this one. And since I mentioned budget, every single card in this deck outside of the commander is less than $1, so it's a very budget-friendly deck. And when I'm going through the cards on this episode, I'm going to be breaking things down into different tactics to show you how this deck works and how we're going to win with it. And if you are interested in this deck, make sure you check out the link in the description below for the deck list. And now with all that said, let's jump into it. Now first, I do want to mention that I have done an episode actually on those shrine tokens that this commander makes, and my advice to you would be not to buy them because, well, as I mentioned in this episode that you're seeing on the screen with this thumbnail, Wizards had a bit of a mishap in printing these, and essentially the supply is incredibly low, so these shrines, at one point were like $15 or so. Wizards somewhat tried to fix it, and now they're like $6 or so, but that's per shrine token. So you can either find some custom art versions of these from some fantastic artists out there, or, like me, maybe just make your own. See, happy little shrine token. And what's more fun than dominating your opponents with a happy little shrine token? Anyways, okay, now that that's been covered, now let's jump into the cards. So first up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice to get a basic land into play tapped. Another fantastic turn 1 play is Search for Tomorrow, which we can suspend 2 for a green and get a basic land into play untapped. And then Font of Fertility is basically an enchantment version of Wayfarer's Bauble, but we pay 1 and a green to sacrifice it. And speaking of enchantments, we're also going to be running Fertile Ground, which is going to have one of our lands tap for an extra mana of any color. And with even some of our ramp package being enchantments, that can help with some other cards that we'll get to here in a bit. Regardless, moving on, we've got some more fantastic land ramp at 2 mana with cards like Rampant Growth, Secure Tri-Builder, and Edge of Autumn. Rampant Growth is going to get us a basic land into play tapped, and Secure Tri-Builder does the exact same thing, thank you Steve, by sacrificing it. And then Edge of Autumn is going to get us that basic land into play tapped if we control 4 or fewer lands, or we can cycle it away by sacrificing a land. And finally, we've also got some cards that can get us 2 lands with Cultivate, Grow from the Ashes, and Vastwood Surge. Cultivate's going to get us 1 basic into play tapped in, 1 into our hand, and Grow from the Ashes is going to get us 2 basics into play untapped if we kicked it. Speaking of kicking, there's Vastwood Surge, which says, search your life for the 2 basic lands, put them on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. If this spell is kicked, put 2/1 counters on each creature you control. Again, this deck can definitely go wide, and this can make our little 1/1 shrines much more threatening as 3/3s. On top of just being a fantastic ramp spell earlier on in the game. But now that we've talked about ramping, let's move on to the shrines. First up, let's talk about those new shrines that we got in Kamigawa, starting off with Go-Shintai, Boundless Vigor, Lost Wisdom, and Ancient Wars. Boundless Vigor is a 1/1 with trample that says at the beginning of your end step you may pay 1. When you do, put a +1 counter on target shrine for each shrine you control. Even with just our commander in play and then getting this into play, that's what, 4 shrines in total in play with nothing else. So at your end step, yeah, just paying 1 mana to get 4 counters on a creature, sign me up for that. And of course, that's just the beginning. Once we're set up, we can flood the board pretty quickly with shrines, and yeah, this can just pump out counters like no one's business. Regardless, next up there's Lost Wisdom, a 0/4 flyer with that same end step trigger, and I'll just, not repeat that for every single one of these, even though I'm talking more about it now. Anyways, when you do, target player mills X cards or X number of shrines you control. Now, it might be slightly counterintuitive, but this is one that you actually might want to target yourself with to start off. Again, your commander is able to get enchantments from your graveyard directly into play. So, in a way, it's kind of like a second hand just for enchantments. And obviously, later on in the game, you can also utilize this to take opponents out by milling them. Speaking of which, there's Ancient Wars, a 2/2 with first strike that has that end step pay 1, and when you do, it deals X damage target player or planeswalker X the number of shrines you control. This can dish out an absurd amount of damage once you get things going. I mean, just think about paying 1 mana to dish out, 10 damage or something like that to someone's face? Yeah, they're not going to last very long with that. And speaking of lasting, how about Hitting Cruelty, a 2/2 with Death Touch with that end step pay 1. When you do, destroy target creature with toughness X or less or X the number of shrines you control. So yeah, throughout the game you can wipe out a lot of creatures with this. Moving on, Shared Purpose is a 1/3 with Vigilance that says, beginning of your end step you may pay 1 if you do create a 1/1 color spirit creature token for each shrine you control. So yeah, we can flood the board with shrines, and how we can really flood the board with a ton of spirits on top of that. And yeah, something like a Basswood Surge or some cards that we'll talk about here in a bit can be great ways to make them hit even harder. Next up though, let's move on to those M21 shrines, starting off with Sanctum of Tranquil Light. It has pay 5 and a white, tap target creature. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each shrine you control. It's not going to take a long time at all for this just to cost a single white mana to actually start tapping down creatures. And yeah, obviously that could be a very great defensive move or even an offensive move to help get our creatures through. Next up though, a really hard hitting card is Sanctum of Stone Fangs. It says at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, or X is the number of shrines you control. This can be a fantastic way to pad our life total and to take our opponents out very quickly once we're set up. Next up there's Fruitful Harvest, which says at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, add X mana of any one color X the number of shrines you control. This can give us an absurd amount of mana and can put us way ahead of our opponents. Next up, there's Sanctum of Shattered Heights, which has pay 1, discard a land card or a shrine card. Sanctum of Shattered Heights deals X damage to our creature or planeswalker X the number of shrines you control. So again, like Go-Shintai of Hitting Cruelty, this is a fantastic way of controlling the board. And we can keep our hand chock full of shrines and lands with a card like Sanctum of Calm Waters. It says at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you may draw X cards or X the number of shrines you control. If you do, discard a card. The amount of card advantage that this can generate us throughout the game is absolutely absurd. And speaking of advantage, well, none of these shrines provide us quite the advantage that Sanctum of All does because, well, it is the shrine of all shrines. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may search your library and or graveyard for a shrine card and put it on the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. And if an ability of another shrine you control triggers while you control 6 or more shrines, that ability triggers an additional time. So this can help us tutor out the exact shrine that we need, either from our library or even our graveyard for the situation that we're in. And on top of that, again, it doubles up every single one of our shrine triggers, which can be incredibly valuable and incredibly deadly. Now, as powerful as Sanctum of All is, and believe me, it is incredibly powerful, in my opinion, there is one other card in this deck that stands above it, and that is the Golden Pig of this deck. The Golden Pig is the number 1 card out of our 99, and the Golden Pig for this deck is Song of the World Soul. Song of the World Soul is an enchantment for 4 white, and it says, whenever you cast a spell, populate. And of course, populating means you create a token that's a copy of a creature token you control. So with this, essentially all we need is 1 shrine token in play, and we can really get things going. Again, the more and more shrines that we come into play, the more and more effective every single one of our shrines is. And this helps things get really out of hand because, again, our commander obviously can, again, make shrines whenever it comes into play or when our shrines come into play. But with this now, it's like, hey, whenever you cast any spell, it doesn't matter what it is, you get an extra shrine. This really makes things get out of control really quickly, and that's why it is the Golden Pig. But of course, we're not done with our populate effects just yet, so let's move on to cards like Growing Ranks and Selesnya Uologist. Growing Rank says at the beginning of your upkeep, populate, and Selesnyologist has pay 2 and a green to exile target creature card from a graveyard, then populate. Each of these are fantastic repeatable ways to populate throughout the game. Speaking of which, we've got Geared Conclave Exile, which has, when it enters the battlefield, create a 4/4 green Rhino creature with trample, but more importantly, whenever it attacks, populate. The token enters the battlefield tapped and attacking. And then a fantastic mana dump in this deck, which can really work well if that shrine that gives us a ton of mana is full flowering. Because this one costs XX and a green, and it says populate X times. So this one can make us a ton of shrines at once. But of course, we also have some individual populate effects with cards like Druid's Deliverance, Sundering Growth, and Rootborne Defenses. Druid's Deliverance is going to prevent all combat damage to be dealt to us this turn, and then we populate. So this can be a great combat trick and save us in a really tough situation. Sundering Growth is a great removal spell, destroy target artifact or enchantment, then populate, and Rootborne Defense is a fantastic way to protect our team. Populate, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. But getting these shrines into play and populating can help us out in a different way as well. Because we're also going to be running some cards that care about when enchantments come into play with cards like Nessian Wanderer, Grim Guardian, and Thought Render Lamia. Nessian Wanderer has Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a land card from among them and put that card in your hand, put the rest bottom of your library in a random order. This can be a fantastic way to not only ensure that we hit our land drops, but also a great way to utilize Sanctum of Shattered Heights to take out a lot of creatures, again, by discarding lands to ping them for damage. But we can also take our opponents out with something like Grim Guardian, which has Constellation. Whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. Speaking of losing things, though, an incredibly brutal and incredibly effective card in this deck is Thought Render Lamia. It has whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent discards a card. Just think about this. Every single time one of our shrines comes into play, again, we get a shrine token, so that is 2 triggers on this, making our opponents each discard 2 cards. Then, of course, by populating, well, our opponents really aren't going to have a hand at a certain point. And speaking of brutal effects, we also have Doomwake Giant, which can help us control the board. Whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, creatures opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn. So with this, we can wipe out a ton of creatures and help keep the board clean. But on the other side of things, we can also grow our army with Archon of Sun's Grace, which says Pegasus creatures you control have lifelink, and whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, create a 2/2 white Pegasus creature token with flying. In a somewhat similar way, we've got a Johnny's Chosen, which is going to make us a 2/2 white cat creature token whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under our control. But now that we've talked about all these fantastic effects, how are we actually going to get to these cards? First up, we've got some fantastic card advantage spells like Rite of Harmony, Shamanic Revelation, and Camaraderie. Rite of Harmony says, whenever a creature or enchantment enters the battlefield under your control this turn, draw a card, and we can flash it back. Shamanic Revelation says, draw a card for each creature you control, and you gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. And then Camaraderie is somewhat similar. It says you gain X life and draw X cards or X number of creatures you control. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Each of these are fantastic ways helping us draw a ton of cards at once. Speaking of which, there's Return of the Wild Speaker, which is a flexible card. It says, choose 1, draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, or non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. And then we've got a great mana dump with Pull for Tomorrow, which is going to help us draw X cards in this card to card at instant speed. And then Factor Fiction is also an instant that says, reveal the top 5 cards of your library, and opponent separates those cards into 2 piles, put 1 pile in your hand, the other into your graveyard. And again, keep in mind, if we are actually putting enchantments in our graveyard, we still are going to be able to get access to those with our commander. So with that in mind, now let's talk about a card like Gravebreaker Lamia. It's an enchantment creature that has, when it enters the battlefield, search your library for a card, put that card into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. Essentially, this is a fantastic way to tutor out enchantments, and again, if this ever gets dealt with, it is in our graveyard, we can actually just get this back with our commander to tutor out another enchantment and get into our graveyard, which our commander can then help us get back. So yeah, that's a fantastic way for us to get out things like, Sanctum of All, or, Song of the World Soul, or anything else that we might need. Next up, though, there's Mythos of Brokos, which has, if blue-black was spent to cast a spell, search your library for a card, put that card into your graveyard, then shuffle your library, and return up to 2 target permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. Finally, though, we've got Plea for Guidance, which is going to tutor 2 enchantment cards from our library right into our hand, which of course can help us set ourselves up for a massive play. But now that we've talked about setting ourselves up in our plan, let's talk about ways to throw a wrench into our opponent's plans. First up, we've got Depart the Realm, which is going to bounce target non-land permanent back to its owner's hand, and we can foretell it for a blue. Keep in mind, this can also be utilized to actually save one of our shrines as well, bouncing it back to our hand if it's being, targeted to be removed, and then we can just, replay it and get another shrine thanks to our commander. And speaking of a flexible card, next up there's Return to Nature, which can either destroy an artifact, enchantment, or exile a card from a graveyard. And then there's Beast Within, which can destroy any permanent and replace it with a 3/3 beast creature token. Moving on though, there's Oblation, which can make the owner of target non-land permanent shuffle into their library, then draw 2 cards. And keep in mind, there might be some times that we actually want to target one of our own things. But something that we're definitely not going to be targeting our own things with is Crush Contraband. It says choose one or both exile target artifact, exile target enchantment. And then Aether Gale is going to bounce 6 target non-land permanents back to their owner's hands. So this is a great way to pick the most threatening things on the board and bounce them back. And yes, if we need to bounce one of our things back, we can. Next up though, we've got some wraths that can be pretty one-sided with cards like Austere Command, Extinguish All Hope, and In Garruk's Wake. Austere Command says choose 2 destroy all artifacts, destroy all enchantments, or destroy all creatures with converted mana cost 3 or less, or destroy all creatures with converted mana cost 4 or greater. Whereas Extinguish All Hope is going to destroy all non-enchantment creatures, so our shrines are safe. And then In Garruk's Wake says destroy all creatures you don't control at all planeswalkers you don't control. So this can wipe our opponent's boards clean and keep ours in place. But of course, we're not quite done with messing with our opponent's plans just yet. So we've also got some ways to protect our spells and our things with cards like Negate, Unwind, and Saw It Coming. These are some fantastic counter spells. Negate's going to counter target non-creature spell. Unwind does the exact same thing, but we also untap it to 3 lands. And Saw It Coming can counter any spell, and we can foretell it for 1 in a blue. We can also protect our entire team, though, with Your Temple is under attack, which says choose 1, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn, or you and target opponent each draw 2 cards. So we can use this to save our team, or we can utilize it in a political way to draw some cards and to help an opponent out. But of course, we've got some ways to protect our commander as well with Swiftfoot Boots, which is going to give it Hexproof and Haste, and Giant's Amulet, which gives it Hexproof, well, +0/+1, and Hexproof as long as it's untapped. Finally, though, we've got some ways to pump our commander and our entire team with cards like Dictative Heliod and Collective Blessing. Dictative Heliod has flash and says creatures you control get +2/+2, and Collective Blessing is going to give our creatures +3/+3. So again, our army of shrines and whatever other tokens we're going to be making might start off small, but we can make them much more deadly with these in play. But now that we've talked about every single non-land card in this deck, let's talk about the lands. So there's Command Tower, which taps for any of our colors, Exotic Orchard, which can tap for any of our colors most of the time, and Path of Ancestry, which enters the battlefield tap but can tap for any of our colors. Next up, we've got Ash Barrens, which has basic land cycling, and Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, which we can each tap and sacrifice to go get a basic land and play tapped. Speaking of which, we've got the new Streets of New Capenna fetches that essentially, when they enter the battlefield, we sacrifice them and get 1 of 3 lands into play tapped, and we gain 1 life. Next up, we've got 3 lands that can actually help ramp us by getting us 2 lands with Crow's Verge, Mirror Landscape, and Blighted Woodland. And then we've got the Thriving Lands that enter the battlefield tapped. It can tap for 1 of 2 colors, one of which we can choose when it comes into play. And of course, finally, we're rounding out this deck with basic lands, including, you guessed it, plains, islands, swamps, mountains, and forests. But now that we've talked about every single card in this deck, let's talk about the price. Like I mentioned at the start of this episode, every single card in this deck outside of the commander is less than $1, so it's a very budget-friendly deck, even though the commander itself is about $5. And actually, this estimated cost of $34.05 also includes basic lands at 10 cents a piece, so if you already got those basics, there's some extra savings there. And speaking of potential savings, you might be able to save even more by buying this deck on TCG Player and utilizing heavily played and damaged cards, which of course need a home too. Though keep in mind that this estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support.